The ITP is a federally funded program with the sole purpose of identifying new drugs that increase lifespan in mice, the gold standard for validating new longevity interventions. The 2020 cohort of the NIA Interventions Testing Program, we had 2 winners out of 8 new interventions tested. Alpha-estradiol has been tested 3 times by the Intervention Testing Program, and in every case, there was this male-specific increase in lifespan. That brings to 8 the number of unique drugs with at least a 10% effect on lifespan in either males or females. My name is Matt Caberline, and welcome to the Optispan YouTube channel. Hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan podcast. On today's episode, we're going to cover the latest paper to come out of the National Institute on Aging Interventions Testing Program. The title of the paper, published in Geroscience, is Lifespan Effects in Male Het3 Mice Treated with Sodium Thiosulfate, 16-hydroxyestradiol, and late-start Canagliflozin. So as many of you know, I'm sure, the ITP is a federally funded program with the sole purpose of identifying new drugs that increase lifespan in mice. It was started in 2004, and over the past couple of decades, I would say has really risen to become the gold standard for validating, or in some cases not validating, new longevity interventions. I'm going to actually start this episode by reading the description of the ITP from the NIA website. It says, the Interventions Testing Program is a peer-reviewed program designed to identify agents that extend lifespan and health span in mice. Investigators at any university, institute, company, or other organization are invited to recommend interventions for testing by submitting an application before the February deadline each year. Testing is carried out in the genetically heterogeneous Het3 mouse stock at 3 sites: the Jackson Laboratory, the University of Michigan, and the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio. Those whose proposed interventions are accepted for testing by the ITP sponsors will collaborate with the ITP principal investigators to develop the test protocol and interpret the data, and will be asked to serve as co-authors on resulting publications. All data will be made freely available to sponsors for use in their grant applications, research talks, etc. So there are a few key points here that I want to emphasize. The first is that anyone can submit a proposal. Anyone in the community can submit a specific intervention to be tested by the ITP. This is not just for academics. In fact, many of the proposals that are submitted actually come from companies or physicians or interested lay people. Second is that every proposal is peer-reviewed. And the way this works, there are actually 2 committees involved in selecting which interventions are tested by the ITP. The first is the access panel. So the way this works is every proposal goes to the access panel. There are 3 members of the access panel that score each proposal, and then the panel gets together to talk about the proposals and rank them. And then there's a second committee, and this is the committee that I've been on for the past 15 or so years, called the steering committee. The steering committee looks at the recommendations of the access panel and then makes the decision about which interventions actually get tested every year. Usually there are between 6 to 8 slots available, and so 6 to 8 proposals can be selected for testing within each cohort each year. Second point I want to make is that this is in the Het3 background. This is important because Het3 is what's called a genetically heterogeneous background. It's actually a 4-way cross of 4 different strains. And so that's important because this provides something that we think is closer to the human situation, where not every animal is genetically identical to its sibling or its cage mate. These are genetically unique individuals. It's still somewhat limited in genetic diversity, but it's probably better than the common inbred strains like C57 Black 6. Another point that's worth recognizing is there's kind of built-in triplicate replication to the ITP because every intervention is tested independently at each of the 3 sites. Again, Michigan, San Antonio, Jackson Laboratories, and Bar Harbor, Maine. That builds in independent replication, especially if you see the same effects across each of the 3 sites. Another really important point is that this is about as unbiased an approach to intervention testing as you can take. The sponsors, who are the ones who recommend the interventions and who write the proposals, can play a role in helping to design the experiment, but they don't have any role in the execution. That's done at the 3 ITP sites. The ITP labs have no real interest or incentive in getting a particular result. So we can be pretty confident that at least there was no bias due to an interest in getting a lifespan extension or failing to get a lifespan extension being introduced into the experiment. So I think that's one of the reasons, combined with the triplicate replication, that really the ITP has become the gold standard for rigor and reproducibility in the field. Additionally, I think it's worth mentioning that all of the data and biosamples are made available to the community. So as an example, we used banked samples from the ITP in our publication on periodontal disease and aging in mice, the first paper we put out. So I had an interview with Jonathan on the podcast where we talked about that work. And some of those samples where we showed that with age, mice develop periodontal disease and that rapamycin-treated mice showed less periodontal disease. Those actually came from the interventions testing program, an example of how the program has made samples available to the field. There are many of those examples. So I've got a pretty long history with the ITP. I'm a large supporter of the program. I think it's a very important resource for the field. I actually first began serving on the steering committee in 2012. And I can tell you it's not a perfect system, but it's really, in my experience, about as close as you're going to come in academia. It's really among the 2 best review committees that I've served on, and I've been on a lot of review panels in my day. And I feel like the committee really makes the call 9 out of 10 times that makes the right call. So it functions really well. It's a really good group of individuals. And I've been very, very pleased, and I feel fortunate to have been able to participate in that committee. I will say one of the things I've noticed in the past few years is that the number of really good proposals is getting bigger and bigger every year, and it's really swamping what the ITP system can handle. Again, there's really only 6 to 8 slots available each year. That wasn't always the case. Definitely in the last few years, there are probably 2 to 3 times as many really good proposals as can be tested through the ITP. And I think that we really need a significant expansion of the capacity for rigorous intervention testing in the field. I think this may be something that's worth coming back to in a future episode, but I'd really just like to see some of the larger funders step up and help build this infrastructure for these sort of big idea, really important projects for the field. So hopefully that can happen. Okay, so back to the ITP. And maybe this will help illustrate, the limited capacity over the past 20 years now. 2004, I think, was the first cohort. The ITP has published results on 54 unique drugs, along with 2 pairwise combinations and how these things impact lifespan in mice. Some of the drugs have been tested at more than 1 dose or tested at different starting ages, but there are 54, I think, unique drugs that have been tested in 20 years. We really need to do better than that. And so they make a point in the abstract here to say that with this current paper, there are now 7 individual drugs that increase lifespan by at least 10% in either male or female mice. We'll come back to this point that most of the drugs, really with the exception of rapamycin, that robustly increase lifespan in the ITP, increase lifespan either in male or in female, but not in both sexes. We don't understand that. So I actually counted 7 before this paper. I'm not really sure what the discrepancy is, but the 7 prior winners that I've come up with of at least a 10% effect on lifespan are rapamycin, clearly the most robust of the group, acarbose, Canagliflozin, which we'll talk more about today, 17 alpha-estradiol, which is related to one of the drugs that were tested in this paper, NDGA, captopril, and astaxanthin. And then the 2 combinations that had robust effects on lifespan are acarbose plus rapamycin and metformin plus rapamycin. So that is all published data. But without further ado, let's jump into the 2020 cohort results. So again, title of the paper, if you're interested in looking at the primary research, is Lifespan Effects in Male UMHET3 Mice treated with sodium thiosulfate, 16-hydroxyestriol, and late-start canagliflozin. Okay, so I will read the abstract and kind of comment on it as I go through it. So again, genetically heterogeneous UM-Het3 mice born in 2020. So this is what we call the 2020 cohort. But of course, it takes a few years for the mice to age out. So that's why the paper is being published in 2024. You will often see this, that the publication lags the cohort year by about 4 years. So mice born in 2020 were used to test possible lifespan effects of, and here's the collection of drugs that were tested. Alpha-ketoglutarate, AKG, 2,4-dinitrophenol, hydralazine, Nebivolol, 16-alpha-hydroxyestriol, and sodium thiosulfate, okay? And to evaluate the effects of canagliflozin when started at 16 months of age. So recall, canagliflozin had been previously shown to extend lifespan when started at a young age. Okay, so 16-alpha-hydroxyestriol produced a 15% increase in median lifespan in males, but led to a significant 7% decline in female lifespan. So interesting sex dimorphism there. Canagliflozin started at 16 months, also led to a significant increase, 14% in males, and a significant decline, 6% in females. We'll come back to this. Canagliflozin given to mice at 6 months led, as in our previous study, to an increase in male lifespan without any change in female lifespan. Okay, so that's reproducing what they'd seen in a previous cohort, suggesting that this agent may lead to female-specific late-life harm. So again, I'll come back to this, but the fact that when canagliflozin was started late in life, there was a shortening of female lifespan. When it was started early in life, there was no effect on female lifespan, is consistent with the idea that there's a late life detriment to canagliflozin that might be offsetting an early life benefit, specifically in female mice. Okay. We found that blood levels of canagliflozin were approximately 20-fold higher in aged females than in young males, suggesting a possible mechanism for the sex-specific disparities in its effects. So maybe it's reaching toxic levels in the aged females. Nebivolol was also found to produce a female-specific decline, 4% in lifespan. None of the other tested drugs provided a lifespan benefit in either sex. These data bring to 7 or 8, by my count, the list of ITP-tested drugs that induce at least a 10% lifespan increase in one or both sexes. They also add a fourth drug with demonstrated midlife benefits on lifespan, that's the canagliflozin, and provide a testable hypothesis that might explain the sexual dimorphism in lifespan effects of the SGLT2 inhibitor canagliflozin. Okay, so that's the abstract. Whew, got through that. Now let's take a little bit closer look. So this table shows you the list of interventions tested in the 2020 cohort, the dose, and the starting ages. I don't think it's really worth getting into the doses at this point. Suffice it to say that for every intervention tested, the proposer has to make a case for what dose should be tested and when the dose should be started in terms of the age of the mice at the time the experiment is initiated. Okay, so let's start with the things that didn't work. And again, it's important to keep in mind, a negative result from the ITP doesn't mean necessarily that the drug can't increase lifespan at some dose or in certain strain backgrounds in mice. It just means that at the dose that was tested in UM-Het3, they did not detect a statistically significant effect on lifespan. It also doesn't mean that this drug won't work to impact health span or lifespan in humans at some dose or in certain individuals. But I think it is fair to say that this is viewed as a compelling result if it's a negative result that significantly reduces enthusiasm for an intervention within the field. For better or worse, I think that is the case when a drug fails to show an effect in the interventions testing program. That reduces enthusiasm across the field for that drug as a potential longevity intervention. Okay, so in this regard, it is perhaps worth mentioning some of the notable prior failures to come out of the ITP. These are all drugs that people were pretty excited about that completely failed to show any benefits in the ITP. And these include resveratrol, metformin, nicotinamide riboside, and ficinin. And so it's beyond the scope, I think, of this episode to really get into the details of each of these drugs. I actually just did an episode on resveratrol for those who are interested. I think it's just fair to say that you should be skeptical of people who tout any of these things as longevity drugs, given that they failed to show lifespan extension in the most unbiased and well-controlled studies that have been carried out to date. So again, doesn't mean they can't have any possible benefits, but the best standard of data that we've got, these drugs failed to show any positive effect on lifespan from the ITP. Okay, so who could we add to the 2020 list of disappointments? Probably the highest on this list has to be alpha-ketoglutarate. So alpha-ketoglutarate is a metabolite that is endogenously produced in mitochondria as part of the tricarboxylic acid or TCA cycle. Work from Gordon Lithgow and my good friend Brian Kennedy that was published in 2020 reported that alpha-ketoglutarate could extend lifespan in C. elegans and in mice. And so that was the study, I think, that laid a lot of the groundwork for the incentive to test AKG through the interventions testing program. I've got to say, personally, I was never really convinced by the lifespan data in that study. It wasn't a big effect. And so I never really, I guess I should say, I wasn't a strong believer that AKG is a potent longevity drug in mice based on that one study. I did find the frailty and health span data in that paper to be more convincing, and both the published and some unpublished data that I've seen here look more compelling to me. And so I think it's also probably worth mentioning there is one human study that's been published that reported an 8-year reduction in the epigenetic clock for people taking calcium alpha-ketoglutarate. They also saw a change in the placebo group. So again, a little bit hard to tell how robust or real that result is. But I'd have to say for me, especially given the failure in the ITP, AKG falls pretty solidly towards the bottom of the second tier of longevity interventions that I'm enthusiastic about. I don't personally take calcium alpha-ketoglutarate. I don't think that the bulk of evidence at this point really suggests that this is a robust intervention for modulating the biology of aging in either laboratory animals or people. Again, having said that, the frailty data in mice looks pretty interesting to me. So it may be one of these cases where for certain individuals, it could have a benefit in terms of some metrics of health span, even if it's not a potent modulator of biological aging or longevity. On the positive side, I think there's not much risk from alpha-ketoglutarate. So it's been used as a nutritional supplement for many decades in the form of calcium alpha-ketoglutarate. In fact, it was first marketed for calcium supplementation, not the alpha-ketoglutarate side, particularly for bone density. And so, there may be some benefit from calcium alpha-ketoglutarate independent of the alpha-ketoglutarate part through the calcium supplementation. But again, it's been used widely as a supplement. As far as I know, really nothing in the way of side effects. So the risk profile here is very low. Again, I think the question really is just, how good is the evidence for health span? And again, given the most recent result from the ITP, not very good evidence for longevity at this point. Okay, so the second failure that I was actually more disappointed by was 2,4-dinitrophenol. I actually remember reviewing this as part of the steering committee, being pretty excited about this. So dinitrophenol is a really interesting molecule. It's something called an uncoupler, and it's called that because it can uncouple the proton motive force of the mitochondria from energy generation. And basically it does this by allowing protons to flow across the mitochondrial membrane. And so what this kind of, you can think of it as if your body was a car, like running the transmission in neutral, so you're burning fuel, but you're not going anywhere. That's kind of what the uncouplers do, is they kind of burn energy without creating ATP, or burn carbon without creating ATP by uncoupling the mitochondrial electron transport chain. And so in the 1930s, there was actually quite a bit of interest in DNP as a weight loss drug because it actually works really well, because what you're doing basically is burning through the carbon in the food that you're eating to burn energy. And so people will absolutely lose weight if they take dinitrophenol. So it works really well as a weight loss drug. The problem is that if you push it just a little bit too far, it rapidly causes major problems, and actually several people died from dinitrophenol. And so the FDA pulled it off the market in the late 1930s because people were dying from this weight loss drug. But in recent years, there's been a whole body of literature on sort of low dose levels of uncouplers and potential health benefits associated with low dose levels of dinitrophenol in terms of obesity and metabolic fitness and other potential effects from just kind of burning the mitochondrial engine at a low level. Some people have suggested that this may actually mimic some of the effects of caloric restriction, because one of the things that we see with caloric restriction is an upregulation of endogenous uncoupling proteins that actually have a similar effect to dinitrophenol. So the thought is that this might reduce oxidative stress a little bit or mimic caloric restriction in other ways, in addition to preventing obesity. So it was proposed and accepted as an intervention to be tested by the Interventions Testing Program. In part, the evidence to support this proposal was a 2008 publication reporting that low levels of DNP could increase lifespan in mice. And so I think it's worth maybe taking a look at the data from that paper, because again, this illustrates one of the points that I've made before about short-lived controls in these mouse experiments and getting fooled sometimes by results that seem promising but then don't replicate when they're tested in strains where the controls are longer lived. So if we actually look at the graph from this paper, we can use the rule of thumb. Remember, now the idea here is to just quickly estimate what the median lifespan is for the control and treated groups from these kinds of lifespan experiments. And the way we do this is we look at 50% or 0.5 on the y-axis, which is survival, go straight across to the control group curve, and then go straight down and see where that hits the x-axis. So in this case, that 50% mark, which is median lifespan, is about 102 weeks, or that's about 716 days. Okay, now we do the same thing for the treated group, the group that got DNP, start at 50%, go over to the treated line, and then go down to the x-axis. That puts us at about 110 weeks, or 770 days. So this is shorter than what we would hope to see for a really solid mouse longevity experiment. In fact, we recently published a paper with Brian Kennedy and Camille Pabis at National University of Singapore, making a sort of rule of thumb that we call the 900-day rule. So we would really like to see the long-lived intervention group be above 900 days in order to have a lot of confidence in a result. And so in this case, the long-lived intervention group coming out at 770 days is actually less than where we would really like to see the controls between 850 and 900 days. This is a common pattern. This was the case with nicotinamide riboside. It was the case with metformin, that the studies reporting lifespan extension were done in short-lived experiments where the controls were short-lived. Then when they were tested in the Interventions Testing Program, they failed to extend lifespan. So the literature is full of examples where short-lived controls appear to have led to potentially artifactual lifespan extension that hasn't been reproducible. Again, just because an experiment has short-lived controls, if you see a lifespan extension, it doesn't mean it's not a real result, but I take a degree of skepticism, higher skepticism, when the controls are short-lived and the long-lived group isn't even as long-lived as where the controls should have been, which was the case in this experiment. Okay, now if we compare this to the controls for the ITP 2020 cohort using our same method, start at the 50% or 0.5 on the y-axis, go across to the controls and then go down to the x-axis, you can see the ITP controls in both males and females were well above 800 days. In fact, around 900 days for the females. Again, the long-lived group in the original study with DNP was only 770 days. So the long-lived group in that study aren't even as long-lived as the untreated controls from the ITP. So again, rule of thumb, but it's a good rule of thumb, and I think it works pretty well. So if you're looking at lifespan curves in mice, just remember the 900-day rule. Okay, so we'll move on to hydralazine. This is an FDA-approved drug as an antihypertensive. It was approved in 1953. It works as a very strong vasodilator, so it relaxes the arterial smooth muscle. It's a pretty potent vasodilator, probably more potent than ACE inhibitors, at least that's my understanding, used to treat high blood pressure acutely and also for heart failure. And in 2021, this was actually the 106th most prescribed drug in the United States. So it's a very important medication. I would say the evidence here for longevity was pretty weak, probably weaker than many of the interventions that get tested by the ITP. So there were 2 worm papers reporting lifespan extension in Caenorhabditis elegans. They came from the same lab. Personally, I wasn't really in favor of testing this one. One of the papers suggested that the mechanism was through sirtuins, and those of you who have kind of followed me, you'll know that I tend to be very skeptical of papers that make connections to sirtuins as the mechanism of action. Regardless, there wasn't a ton of evidence supporting the idea that this drug was a potent longevity drug, but was FDA approved, clearly has some medical uses in people, was tested, did not show a benefit in the ITP. Nebivolol is another drug in the FDA-approved category. This one is a beta blocker, FDA-approved in 2007, so relatively recently. This one was tested based on the idea that it is a novel class of mTOR inhibitor. So again, I'm not really aware of any longevity data for this drug, but of course we know that rapamycin, which is the most effective drug to come out of the ITP, is a specific inhibitor of mTOR complex 1. Nebivolol was identified from a high-throughput screening assay to bind to mTOR by Gino Cortopassi and colleagues, and then some evidence was provided in cell culture models that this drug could inhibit mTOR complex 1. So that was really the rationale for testing it. The rationale makes sense. Again, I don't know how convincing it is that this is really a potent inhibitor of mTOR in vivo in animals, but regardless, it did not show a lifespan extension in the ITP at the dose tested. Again, I don't think we can really conclude much from that because I'm not really convinced that it actually effectively inhibited mTOR in the animals that were treated. So a little bit hard to know what that means. The next drug that did not show an effect was sodium thiosulfate. This is a sulfide donor molecule. This is, again, an interesting drug. It's used clinically. I think its most common use is to reverse cyanide poisoning, and this is actually on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. This drug was tested by the ITP based on the idea that sulfide donors can reverse certain chemical modifications in proteins that happen with aging and restore the function of those proteins. And there's a pretty good body of literature, mostly in C. elegans, that hydrogen sulfide can have an impact on longevity, that caloric restriction can increase hydrogen sulfide, which can act as a sulfide donor. So the idea here was that this might be a more potent sulfide donor that could have an effect on longevity. It turns out it did not increase lifespan in the ITP. There are at least one other drug that was previously tested by the ITP, again, through the model of a sulfide donor mechanism that also did not extend lifespan in the ITP. Okay, so those are the drugs that didn't work. Now let's talk about the winners for 2024. So the first up is Canagliflozin, super interesting drug. This is part of a class of drugs called the SGLT2 inhibitors, or sodium glucose cotransporter 2 inhibitors. For those of you who watched the episode I did on the study from Epiturna that looked at prescription medications in the United Kingdom and their association with all-cause mortality. This is one of the drugs that, when prescribed to people, again, at least in the UK data set, was associated with lower all-cause mortality. These drugs are anti-diabetes drugs, and they work primarily by blocking the reabsorption of glucose by the kidney. So basically, you just pee out more glucose, and that reduces blood glucose levels. So clearly beneficial for diabetes. And there's growing evidence in people that these drugs may be beneficial for blood pressure, kidney disease, heart disease, weight loss, and I'm sure other things will come down the pike in future research. So again, this molecule was also associated with lower all-cause mortality, and the episode I'd refer you to is these 14 medications are linked to lower death rates in humans. Longevity this week, number 4. So canagliflozin was first tested by the ITP in the 2016 cohort, published in 2020. Again, remember the 4-year lag from the cohort to the year of publication, where it was reported to extend lifespan when started at 7 months of age, so in young mice. In that study, it was male specific, so it increased lifespan in male mice, had no effect on lifespan when started in female mice. So it was tested here as part of what is called the phase 2 studies in the ITP, where a drug that has shown a positive effect in phase 1 can be selected for further testing, either at a different dose or at a different age of onset or both. And so here it was tested starting at a later age, 16 months, at 2 of the 3 sites. At one of the sites, it was tested starting at 6 months. I'm not sure. I probably knew. I don't recall why this difference in sites happened, but this did break the sort of triplicate replication model of the ITP in the sense that only 2 of the sites did the 16-month onset. Okay. So in both groups, the 6 and 16-month groups, the male mice showed lifespan extension. In the 6-month group, there was no effect on lifespan, but in the 16-month group, the female mice showed a significant reduction in lifespan, which is pretty interesting and not that typical, actually, to see lifespan shortening from the interventions testing program. So we can take a look at the actual data. Again, the lifespan extension looks pretty robust. The lifespan shortening is, it's not huge, right? So again, is this statistically significant? Is it something where I would really hang my hat on it? I don't know. It's probably real, but it's not a very large effect. So again, lifespan shortening is pretty uncommon in the ITP. I don't know what the total number is, but it's probably less than 5 of drugs that have showed a negative effect on lifespan. Interestingly, we had 2 this year. So that's kind of interesting and not something that's seen commonly. It does raise the possibility, as suggested in the paper, that canagliflozin in females specifically has a detrimental effect late in life, and that may actually be offsetting a benefit in the females from early life treatment, which is why the lifelong treatment in the females basically has no effect. It's like you're canceling the effects out. Now, that's pure speculation, may or may not be the case, but it is sort of interesting to think about. And I think this idea that higher levels of drugs, specifically in aged mice, or certain drugs at the levels that could increase lifespan in young mice can actually cause problems in aged mice is interesting. And we're seeing evidence for this with potentially other molecules like nicotinamide mononucleotide as well, that specifically in aged mice, you can get toxicities due to metabolism of these drugs that may be beneficial early in life. So that might be what's happening here, specifically in the female mice. It was also interesting that in the female mice, there was about 20-fold higher levels of canagliflozin, specifically in the aged females compared to young males. So maybe some drug metabolism leading to toxicity effects there. But I think a lot more research really needs to be done to really tease this out. I do think it's important here, though, to be careful that we don't over-interpret the data from the ITP, specifically in these sex-specific effects that we don't really understand for their relevance in humans. So I mentioned earlier acarbose. Acarbose shows a similar sex-specific effect on longevity in the ITP, as does 17-alpha estradiol and the estradiol molecule that we'll talk about in a minute, all show this sex-specific effect in males that may or may not actually tell us anything about the potential impact in humans. And so in the case of the SGLT2 inhibitors, if we go back to this study from the UK population looking at all-cause mortality there, I don't recall any sex-specific difference between males and females. In other words, this association with SGLT2 inhibitors and lower all-cause mortality did not appear to be male-specific in that study. So again, given that we don't really understand what's going on with the sex specificity in the ITP and whether it's a Het3 unique feature, I just want to be a little bit careful that we don't assume that the same sex specificity is going to apply in humans. And so for now, I think we just have to accept that this mechanism underlying the sex specificity, we really don't understand very well, and it's a mystery that remains to be solved. Okay, so now let's talk about the last molecule that was tested in 2020, also showed a positive effect on lifespan. This is 16-alpha hydroxyestradiol. So this is also known as estriol. So you'll see it sometimes referred to that. This is a weak estrogen, and it only has about 10 to 20% of the binding affinity of estrogen for the estrogen receptor. And it's used primarily clinically as part of hormone replacement therapy for menopausal symptoms in women. Okay, so this is part of HRT for some women. So again, this is super interesting to me because like the SGLT2 inhibitors, estriol came out as a winner in the study from the UK population as a drug that was associated with lower all-cause mortality. And again, I'd refer you to the episode where we really do a deep dive into that paper if you want to get a closer look at this. But it was interesting to me that estriol and I think 5 other estrogens out of the 16 molecules that were associated with lower all-cause mortality were in the class of the estrogens. So that was probably the strongest signal to me that came out of that study. Interestingly there, that was only in women because it was only in women where enough people had been prescribed these estrogen molecules. So again, in that study, there was a strong correlation between estrogens, including this molecule, and lower all-cause mortality in women specifically. Okay, so why was 16-alpha hydroxyestradiol tested by the ITP? And this goes back to 17-alpha estradiol, which I previously mentioned, which had been shown by the ITP to increase lifespan specifically in male but not female mice. So this was seen in the 2009 cohort, started at 10 months of age, and then again in the 2011 cohort at a higher dose. And then 17-alpha estradiol was also tested again in the 2016 cohort at a higher dose, but beginning late in life at 20 months of age. And in every case, there was this male-specific increase in lifespan. So again, let me just say that again because it was a little bit complicated. So 17-alpha estradiol has been tested 3 times by the intervention testing program, starting at 10 months of age, starting at young age, but at a higher dose, and then starting at 20 months of age, which is about the mouse equivalent of a 60-year-old person. In every case, it increased lifespan in males, but not in female mice. Okay, so again, a very, very robust and reproducible effect, but sex-specific in its effect from 17-alpha estradiol. So it was also observed in a metabolomic study that the Het3 mice treated with 17-alpha estradiol had elevated levels of 2 specific metabolites in their livers, estriol 3-sulfate and 16-oxoestradiol 3-sulfate. Okay, so the names don't really matter. Just appreciate that these are 2 molecules that are intermediates in the conversion of 17-alpha estradiol to 16 alpha hydroxyestriol. And so the hypothesis was that 16 alpha hydroxyestriol may be a downstream component of the mechanism by which 17 alpha estradiol was increasing lifespan, specifically in male mice, and that the 16 alpha hydroxyestriol might increase lifespan in both male and female mice. Okay, so hopefully that was clear. Again, short answer is this molecule was tested because the thought was this might be downstream in the lifespan extension pathway for 17 alpha estradiol, and that it might give both male and female effects rather than the male specific effects that had been previously seen. And that appears to be half correct. So it did in fact increase lifespan, but again, it was only in male mice. Interestingly here, there appeared to be a small but statistically significant lifespan shortening effect in female mice. I don't know what that shortening effect means, but it does appear to be the case that this metabolite is in the pathway for how 17 alpha estradiol is increasing lifespan in male mice. So that's interesting. Now, again, I want to come back to that UK study because there, these estrogens, including estriol and estradiol, were associated with lower all-cause mortality, specifically in females, in humans. So again, just re-emphasizing the idea that I don't want to draw too much from this sex-specific, male-specific effect in the Het3 mice to conclude that the same sex-specific effect is going to be present in humans. We just don't know, okay? So I think what we really need at this point, obviously, is a mechanistic understanding for what's underlying these sex-specific effects and whether these sex-specific effects are somehow specific to Het3. And so again, I alluded to earlier that Het3 is genetically mixed, which probably makes it a better strain background for longevity testing than a very inbred strain like C57 Black 6. But it would be interesting to know of these interventions that have a sex-specific effect in Het3, do they also have a sex-specific effect in something like C57 Black 6 in mice? Because if they increase lifespan in both males and females in a different strain background, that might tell us that there's something here about females in Het3, or males, I suppose, that are leading to this sex-specific effect. I think we just really don't know at this point. Okay, so that wraps the 2020 cohort of the NIA Interventions Testing Program. We had 2 winners out of 8 new interventions tested, estriol and late-life canagliflozin. So again, by my count, that brings to 8 the number of unique drugs with at least a 10% effect on lifespan in either males or females, and 4 now that show late-life benefits. Those would be rapamycin, acarbose, 17 alpha estradiol, and now canagliflozin. And finally, for at least 1 more year, rapamycin remains as the ITP world champion and gold standard longevity drug. We'll see if somebody from the 21 cohort can unseat rapamycin. And as always, thanks for watching. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them below. And specifically, if you like this kind of deep dive into the ITP, let us know. We can absolutely do more episodes looking at prior years, upcoming interventions being tested, hopefully some interviews with the folks involved in the ITP. If you're not yet a subscriber, please hit that subscribe button. And I hope to see you next time on the Optispan podcast.